We finished our coffee just as Omu finished her direct information interface with Truffles and rejoined us. I hope he was worth it. Let me know if it starts hurting when you pee, I joked to the android. She retorted almost instantly. It never did after I started having my way with your shell while you were away in virtual, John. I suspect Truffles is much safer. Uxa barked out a laugh at my expression. I joined her when Truffles added, I am, to the conversation. Omu became serious and turned to Uxa. I am most impressed and must congratulate you, Uxa. You have likely increased humanity's chances for long-term survival by an order of magnitude or more. What the hell had Ux done here? I knew she usually studied advanced propulsion technologies. Maybe there had been a breakthrough, but why so much secrecy? There is still a lot of work to do, Omu, Uxa replied, and a few impossible-seeming problems to solve. Have you created warp drive or something? I asked Ux. Not quite. Shall we go see? Instead of answering, I extracted myself from the low G cradle and stood. Uxa stood with me and pushed herself towards a solid-looking door near her work console. It opened and Omu and I followed her through. Beyond was another narrow tunnel. More tunnels. This one was metal and seemed to lead upwards from the work area. The door sealed behind us as we passed. We pulled ourselves along the tunnel until we came to another heavy door at its far end. I estimated we had come 40 or 50 meters, while ascending about 20. The door opened into an airlock, but the far door was already standing open. There were also a pair of pressure suits hanging in the lock, and I could tell that one was Ux's from its size and coloration. Uxie explained that experiments in the past had been done in a full vacuum, but today our demonstration area would have a breathable atmosphere, so no suits were needed. She did give me a radiation badge to clip onto my shirt, though. Apparently, she had done early work on Gombado's new engines, and they had bombarded the area with neutrons. She reassured me that the levels from today's demonstration would be far lower. The room beyond the airlock was a long rectangle. On the left was a series of heavy windows with work consoles and small airlock pass-throughs below the glass. There were 4 of these stations located about 8 meters apart. The right side of the room was dominated by a single larger and heavily armored window. Each of its thick crystalline panes was set in a robust-looking metal framework. There were metal shutters on the outside of the glass, which currently were closed, blocking any view of what lay beyond. Ux directed us to the first of the smaller windows on the left. Lights came on in the 5-meter cubicle chamber beyond. I spotted a large extendable manipulator arm mounted just inside the chamber next to the observation window, but otherwise the chamber was empty. Note the empty experiment chamber, John, Ux said. Her statement made me look again. This time I gave the chamber a more thorough inspection. I could see that there were scorch marks here and there on the floor, walls, and ceiling. It was also clear that the floor had been repaired many times with overlapping patches. The patches were concentrated near the chamber's far end. I noticed similar patches on the walls and ceiling. The chamber had seen some hard use. Had she been testing explosives or volatile compounds here? Okay, I replied, drawing the word out questioningly. She then led Omu and me to the single console centered in front of the large armored window on the room's opposite side. There was a series of hand and foot loops around the console, so I locked my feet in place. This workstation also had an airlock pass through below the glazing. I noted the console displays were showing various statuses and energy levels for something. It was all way over my head. UXE stood at the console and placed an interface cap over her head, making sure that the cap's cranial transducer pads were aligned with those embedded in her skull. The cabling looked like a heavy braid as it dropped behind her and entered the console. Yes, I was freaked out a bit. How are we doing, Truffles? Ux asked out loud, most likely for my benefit. Energy levels are at 96%. Matter streams are charged and in a stable suspension pattern. Confinement lasers are cooled to operating temperatures. No space vessels are currently operating within the minimum radius from this location, Ux, Truffles said. Open the blast shutters, please, Ux said. She then turned towards me. Hold on to your hat, John. We watched the panels slowly slide down, uncovering the large window. The gigantic test chamber, which was now exposed, made me gasp. It had to be well over 200 meters in diameter and 60 meters tall. The circular walls were the rough-hewn rock of the asteroid. Were we looking at a crater on Vesta's surface? I looked up, and instead of the blackness of space, there was a perfectly smooth, white-colored cover over the entire area. Yux was watching me and explained that the circular space was open to the vacuum of space, but that there was a thin membrane forming a roof. The membrane was radio and visually opaque to hide the experiments from outside view, but was also thin enough so as to not contain any explosions if there were a catastrophe. At first, I just nodded at her explanation. Wait, what? I finally sputtered out. Catastrophe? She smiled. Relax. We've moved past those kinds of events. Mostly. This time she laughed at my expression. I'm kidding. Today's demonstration is perfectly safe. We've done it many times without incident. My attention was drawn back to the giant experiment chamber when additional bright lights mounted around the perimeter were switched on. Most were focused on the center of the space, but a few were illuminating the underside of the membrane. The bright chamber now revealed what was likely the reason I had been brought here. My mouth dropped open again as I took in the device. It was a complex-looking donut of gadgetry, which must have been almost 100 meters in diameter. The torus of technical wizardry was itself 40 meters in diameter, with almost a third of that recessed below the perforated floor of the chamber. I estimated the void or hole in the middle of the torus had a diameter of around 20 meters. Attached to the exterior of the torus was a maze of conduits, piping, and huge superconductor cables. This was clearly where all that stored energy from the ESU chamber ended up. I continued to survey the chamber. The big central torus was not alone. Elsewhere around the large chamber were other, smaller tori. Some were intact, but many were partially disassembled. I realized they might be new experiments under construction, but I had no way of knowing for sure. Were they the remains of earlier or failed experiments, or the next evolution of the current one? I then spotted evidence of melted components and other damage. They were failed experiments. One of the objects had been an even larger torus than the current one centered in the chamber. Dozens of mobile units were busy around these remains, continuing to remove pieces from the wreckage. I returned my attention back to the central torus as there was new activity. Some of the pipes connected to the torus had tiny streams of vapor leaking from them. Coolant or fuel? Ilksy remained unconcerned. What was this thing? Some kind of huge electric xenon thruster? Or was it some sort of fusion engine? I had not spotted any fuel tankage as of yet, but I imagined they could be off on the surface somewhere remote. Did you build a new type of thruster? Or is this some sort of magnetic or reactionless drive? I asked. I had guessed at the last. A neutrino drive would explain the lack of fuel piping. Or maybe it was a gravity drive, I thought with some excitement. She just smiled and shook her head. I guess with my research history, I can't blame you for thinking along those lines. No, this is something completely different. Something unexpected. She then turned and retrieved a small metal cylinder from the console. She looked at the cylinder and then studied me for a moment before handing it to me. Here, you do it. That way you won't think this is a trick of some sort. Open the cylinder, please. I twisted the top and saw that the cylinder was hollow. I also saw that the threaded joint on its cap had a set of rubberized gaskets indicating the cylinder was probably airtight. Now, remove your genealogy amulet and place it in the cylinder, please. I frowned but did as she asked. I folded the necklace carefully and dropped the amulet in the cylinder. The amulet had enough wear marks on it that I would easily be able to recognize it as being mine. I guessed what was coming and resealed the top to the cylinder without being prompted. Uxie nodded and activated a button on the console. Below the window, the hatch leading to the small airlock pass-through opened. Please place the cylinder containing your amulet into the pass-through, John, Ux directed. I did so, and the airlock sealed. I watched through its small viewport and saw that the hatch on the far side of the pass-through cycled open. The cylinder was now exposed to the vacuum of the chamber beyond. A small manipulator arm reached into the airlock and retrieved the cylinder. It then passed the cylinder to the manipulator of a thruster-powered space drone. Through the larger window, we watched the drone take off under rapid-firing jets of compressed gas. It puffed its way silently to the middle of the large chamber, and hovered 10 meters directly above the center of the huge torus. I cranked up my iris's zoom a bit and could clearly make out the cylinder with my amulet still held in the drone's grip. Additional bright spotlights switched on and illuminated both the drone and the center of the torus. I turned to Uxu. "You're going to torch my amulet?" She just shook her head and laughed. "Truffles, start the demonstration, please." The console displays became even more active, and I felt a physical vibration pass through the floor of the chamber. Ux saw my look and explained that it was just the main energy relays cycling. They were apparently physical relays due to the high power levels. I returned to watching the view through the thick windows. The drone was still hovering where it had been before, but now there were other things happening in the large chamber. Electrical discharges were now crawling around some of the conduits and superconductors where they met the sides of the torus. The center of the torus was looking strange. The reflections of the spotlights were becoming distorted, and the white light shining on the area was becoming blue-tinted. There was a waviness which reminded me of heat shimmers. Something was getting very hot at the center of the torus. I suddenly realized that with the outer chamber in a full vacuum, a visible heat shimmer was impossible. What the hell was causing the same effect? A beep came from the radiation tag on my shirt, and I gave it a glance. "It's okay, John. There is a brief spike in high-energy particles as the hole is punched, but the overall levels remain safe." In the torus center, the distortions continued to oscillate back and forth until suddenly they expanded almost instantly, almost to the inner edges of the torus. At the same moment, a shimmering chrome disc appeared in the center of the open space. I rocked back, feeling suddenly dizzy. Ux reached over to steady me. When I recovered, I saw that the chrome disc had stabilized. If I had to guess, I would say it was about 1/2 meter in diameter. "Look in the small chamber behind us, John," Ux said. I turned and saw that the smaller chamber to the left of our workspace now had a matching chrome disc floating near its far wall. It appeared to be the same size as the disc in the center of the torus. While I stared at this new disc, the manipulator arm which was mounted in the smaller room reached out and hovered, waiting with its open grapple just below the disc. I turned back to the large chamber just as Oxy said, "Dropping in 3, 2, 1, drop." The hovering drone released the cylinder containing my amulet, and it fell slowly towards the chrome disc. When it hit, it vanished as if sucked inside. I spun around quickly enough to just catch the manipulator arm, grabbing the still-falling cylinder below the disc floating in the smaller chamber. "What the hell?" Uxe laughed as she reached over to physically close my open mouth. "What do you think? Pretty neat trick, huh?" I was unable to speak. Omu was not as tongue-tied as I was and commented that the demonstration was remarkable. We watched the arm retrieve the cylinder and place it in the small chamber's pass-through. As it did, the chrome disc disappeared. The instant wave of dizziness passed through me a second time. I turned to see that its counterpart in the large chamber was also now gone, along with the surrounding distortion waves and the electrical discharges. Ux removed her cranial interface cap and led me over to the left side of the room while the pass-through cycled. The airlock hatch opened. "Can I touch it?" I asked. "Yes, it's nearly the same temperature as when you deposited it in the other airlock." I reached in and felt the cylinder. She was right. It felt the same temperature as it had been. I realized that the vacuum it had been in would have helped the cylinder hold its temperature, much like a thermos bottle. I opened the top and retrieved my amulet. The casing appeared to have the same wear marks and nicks. I pressed the amulet's activation stud, and the amulet began projecting my family data like normal. Everything survived. "So did you invent a transporter or something?" I asked. "Not exactly, John. What you just saw was what you probably might refer to as a wormhole. Or maybe you might know of it as a bridge through space, as in Einstein-Rosen bridge. There was no conversion of matter to energy and back to matter. The cylinder with your amulet simply started falling in the large chamber and ended its fall in the smaller," she had said simply. Even I was smart enough to realize that there was nothing simple about what I had just seen. I was still having trouble processing what I had just witnessed, much less speaking intelligently about it. "Come, I have enough energy remaining for one more demonstration," Ux said. We returned to the big window, and Uxo again put on the interface cap. Note that the space microdrone is now retrieving a camera probe. The view from the camera is projected on this screen, Uka said. I acknowledged the screen she was pointing at and watched the hovering drone pick up the small camera. It was attached to a 1-meter-long rod, which the drone picked up from the end opposite the camera. Again, it jetted off towards the center of the large chamber where it hovered, waiting. The camera was hanging directly below the drone, and I could still see the view it was transmitting in the small display. Its view swiveled around until I was watching myself through the window. Omu waved. The camera view rotated again until it was directed down towards the center of the torus. I am now establishing a second wormhole, Ux said. Once again there was a tremor as the power relays closed below us, and the electrical discharges began crawling across many of the conduits. The distortion waves again appeared in the center of the torus. I felt that same uneasy feeling I had during the first test. After a few seconds during which the waves oscillate back and forth, the chrome disk snapped into existence. I spun around but did not see a matching disk in the smaller chamber. Ux noted my confused look. This time, the other end of the spatial bridge formed at a location out in space, a few hundred kilometers above Vesta. Please note the display as I lower the camera into the wormhole. I watched the display, which showed the view from the camera. From the top, the disk looked different. Instead of the chrome disk, there was now a black disk full of stars. I couldn't resist and exclaimed, "My God, it's full of stars!" Ux either ignored the reference or was unfamiliar with it. Yes, the current camera view is perpendicular to the surface of the wormhole, so it can see through the hole in space to the other side. Previously, our viewpoints of the wormholes through the windows were nearly edge-on. At that angle, what we saw was in effect a perfect mirror, as it was impossible to perceive the sides of the rip through space-time. She continued after a short pause to see if I was following. Only if our viewpoint is within a few degrees of perpendicular, as the camera is showing now, can you see through the wormhole. I am not sure, but I suspect that there is a funneling or lensing effect caused by the local gravimetric distortions. Regardless, if your view is from roughly above, you can see through the hole in space. The drone was lowering the camera into the wormhole. Out the window, I saw the moment the camera dropped through the chrome disk and disappeared. In the display, I saw the view of the starfield expand as it did so. Now on the other side, the camera swiveled around, and the starfield shifted. An object appeared which was moving against the starfield. It looked like an approaching spaceship. Moments later, I recognized the ship. It was Prancer. Ux had sent the camera out to a location near the parking orbit of the torch ship. This time, I was able to emit an audible, "Wow!" The camera had to rotate quickly to track the spaceship. In seconds, it had grown large, and now was beginning to recede from view. A new alarm sounded at the console, and I saw the space drone start to rise in the chamber, pulling the rod and camera out of the wormhole. The chrome disk winked out suddenly, and the camera view cut off. Again, I felt momentarily dizzy. "Darn it," Ux said. The power dropped before I could fully extract the camera. We watched the hovering drone return to the platform next to the window. Ux had the manipulator arm remove the remains of the camera from its attachment rod and place it into the pass-through airlock. Soon I was holding half of the camera in my hand. It looked like a cutaway display model with a perfectly straight shear line splitting the camera near its middle. "Was the other half destroyed?" I asked. "No, that half is floating in space somewhere near the torch ship's orbit. It will eventually impact Vesta as it falls. Note the perfect shear line in the remains. I have run many experiments and the cut is near infinitesimally thin. There are even short bursts of radiation which are indicative of atoms being split if their electron clouds are broken by the collapsing aperture of the wormhole." Ux shut down her control console and the blast panel slid up to again cover the window. "Well, until the ESUs can be recharged, that's it for my demonstrations. How about we go grab some lunch and talk about my discovery?" That sounded like a perfect plan to me. Maybe after I ate, I'd be able to process what I had just seen and ask intelligent questions. Later that night, I was back in Yuxa's apartment enjoying a long hot shower. We'd spent the afternoon at Uxi's remote work site discussing her discovery. Eventually, I had been saturated with too much information, and we decided to head back to her apartment in the gravity train habitat. Then, needing some alone time to better understand everything I learned, I excused myself to take this shower. I let the water stream over my body while my mind rehashed everything I had seen and heard today. The first hour was spent with her trying to explain the science behind her wormholes. She called them wormholes mostly for my benefit. I'd already forgotten the more correct technical name. In fact, it would not surprise me if I understood less than a tenth of the science behind the amazing technology. Omu kept mostly silent as Ux and I talked. The android had already learned most of the details of the wormhole gadget during its linkage with truffles. Yuxi did her best to fill me in on the backbone of her discovery, which had been the creation of entangled particles of exotic matter. Exotic as in not normal matter or even antimatter, but completely new forms not seen in nature up until recently. Not only had she and truffles, and to a lesser extent Gymnasium, conceptualized the new forms of matter, but they had discovered how to create it in bulk. Then they had to learn how to harness and then isolate entangled particle pairs of the new matter using confinement lasers. Once they had learned how to herd the exotic matter properly, they were able to coax it into propping open one of the infinite holes which had existed throughout space-time since the creation of the universe. Did you know that there were infinite holes worming their way through space all around you? Neither did I until today. I learned that space was like a block of Swiss cheese. The holes were formed and maintained by something which had been called cosmic strings back in my era. The vacuum energy state, which constantly created particle pairs of electrons and positrons, only to instantly destroy them, had been a byproduct of these strings. Yuxei's new entangled exotic matter expanded certain targeted holes and held them open by cosmic string vibration as long as a liberal application of external energy was provided. So while I did not really understand the complete science of the wormholes, I did know all the buzzwords and how they were supposed to interact. At least I understood enough to have a fair grasp of the problems Uxa said were still remaining with the technology. These problems would need to be addressed before we could use the wormholes against our enemy. She had summarized the 4 primary issues, with the first 3 being size, length, and duration. Yux had just shaken her head sadly at my sophomoric attempt at a male anatomy joke upon hearing that. I decided to keep my attempt at humor to myself for the rest of the discussion. She then described the 4th issue, which was the problem of spatial momentum. The first issue was with the size of the wormhole. Despite many attempts at adding power and changing the toroidal hardware, she could not make a reliable wormhole larger than about 30 centimeters in diameter. Trying to send an object larger than that would result in it being torn apart as it grazed the boundaries of the aperture. To further worsen the issue, Ux had observed that the 30-centimeter boundary occasionally fluctuated, growing or shrinking by up to a centimeter. She did not know why. The second length issue was actually one of distance. Her device was unable to target the remote aperture of the wormhole more than about 1,000 kilometers away. Again, she had tried many variations, but could not exceed the distance beyond the current limit. The good news was that she had a working theory that might help. The bad news was that her AI currently lacked the computational power to simulate the conditions needed to develop and test that theory. The third issue was one of duration. Holding her wormholes open required an enormous input of energy, which I had witnessed firsthand in the ESCU chamber. Once that energy was gone, so was the wormhole. Poof! She needed to find ways to reduce the energy needed to stimulate the cosmic strings to a more manageable level, as we needed portals that would remain open for many minutes or even hours. If we could achieve those durations, we could then perform meaningful reconnaissance or even launch attacks via wormhole delivery. The last issue was the problem of spatial momentum. Currently, the wormhole's local and remote aperture points shared the same spatial momentum. I was confused about what this meant at first until she showed me examples. The example which made the most sense to me was where she located her toroidal wormhole creation device on a moving rocket. Then when it formed the wormhole's 2 apertures, the remote end, no matter where it was targeted, would form moving through space in the same direction and at the same speed as the rocket-mounted local aperture was. She extended the concept in the next example. This time, the wormhole device was on a spinning planet. This caused the wormhole device to move through space due to the planet's rotation. If the remote aperture was targeted on the other side of the planet, that aperture would form but would be moving backwards to the planet's spin. In other words, the remote point tracked the local point and matched its movements in space perfectly. Now, extend these examples to our current location on Vesta. The asteroid was spinning with a rotational period of just over 5 hours. It was also in orbit around Sol with an orbital speed of over 19 kilometers per second. Sol was in orbit around the galaxy and traveling at over 200 kilometers per second. I'll ignore the galaxy's motion around the universe for the moment. The first 3 examples of motion were enough. Assume we somehow managed to solve the distance problem and managed to target a wormhole at the assemblage arc's current location. That remote aperture would pop into existence moving at Vesta's current spatial momentum and not the arc's. And since the arc was coasting along at its 7.496% of light speed, even if we popped in right next to it, the arc would pass by in the blink of an eye and be out of range almost instantly. Thus, we needed a way to move the remote aperture of the wormhole as needed, and in real time separately from the local aperture end. Again, Ux had a few basic working theories on how to achieve this, but had no current way to test or develop them. She freely admitted that even trying to design the experiments to test some of her theories was beyond our sciences at this current time. So those were the big 4 issues that still needed solving: wormhole aperture size, remote aperture distance, duration of its existence, and the remote aperture spatial momentum movement problem. It was not all bad news, though. She had also relayed the areas where problems had already been solved or conditions verified. Among these was the fact that the trip through the wormhole did not affect the object passing through it in any detectable way. No heating, no induced radiation, no gravity effects. The object was not transformed to antimatter or turned inside out. This lack of effects extended to living beings. Ux had sent a variety of test animals through the wormholes, and they had emerged none the worse for wear. Beyond animals, she had sent powered processor units containing active partial AI copies of truffles. None had been adversely affected. Even when the packages were equipped with all sorts of sensors, they did not perceive the actual passage from one spatial location to another. As I heard her describe the tests, I realized that if the wormhole orifice had been twice as large, she would have almost certainly have sent herself through by now. I shuddered at the thought. Finally, after answering what few questions I had been intelligent enough to ask, Ux had gotten to the heart of the matter. This was also the reason why I had been asked to come to Vesta. It turns out she needed my help to solve the 4 main issues which I had just mentioned. I was as surprised hearing that as you likely were reading it just now. But rest assured, she did not need my expertise in exotic physics. Instead, she wanted my influence, specifically my influence over Naomi. Before I could begin to be offended by that, I remembered that she had even hinted at her need during her first message to me over a month ago. She had said she needed my help to arrange Naomi's assistance. Today, I learned the full reason why. When Uxa had shared the details, they had scared the bejesus out of me. Ux was convinced that the only way to get her wormhole problem solved was to run dangerous and unapproved experiments in the Forbin complex. She had already sought permission and had been denied. When Naomi had ignored her request for contact, she had gone to the AI advisory group directly, revealing just enough data on her breakthrough and the remaining issues to petition the group for its support of her use of Forbin. After much consideration, additional questions, and many back-and-forth discussions on how this could be done safely, the AI group had ultimately ruled against her. The risks were just too high, they had said, and urged her to continue to attempt to solve the issues through slow experimentation using her current resources. The thought of centuries of little to no progress did not inspire her one bit. Frustrated, she had even run virtual simulations on the outcome of taking her case directly to the human peer science group on Conscientia. The results of the simulations had been less than promising. In fact, she had learned that widespread panic was likely to be the result if humanity learned of what she intended to do at Forbin. This surprised Uso, but not me when she told me. Many humans were still suspicious of AIs in general due to what just one had done to the Earth during the reset. And if you add in the threat of a new godlike AI running amok, we could become downright irrational and paranoid. The simulations had convinced my old partner to not involve greater humanity in her plight, at least at this juncture. Now she was asking me for my help. On the one hand, I understood the fears of the AI Advisory Council. The threat of a Forbin supersentience breach was considerable. On the other hand, the possibilities of solving the problems with the wormhole technology were likely worth risking much. Being able to bombard the enemy arc while it was still light years away, and by using technology which it would never expect as coming from the Earth, were worth a certain amount of risk. Also, I trusted Uxe, and she did have a formidable AI working with her. She had tried to explain to me how Truffles had devised the methods for running the experiment safely, and how to inject her questions into the array and later safely extract and analyze the results. I was not able to grasp the details and remained wary. I then explained my own recent visit to the place and the fears it had triggered. To her credit, she freely admitted that she had limited actual experience with the Forbin complex and its methods, and would need to learn more before attempting any experiments. That admission went a long way towards her credibility and proved she was trying to remain rational about the matter. It also made me realize that I just so happened to know someone who had a great deal of experience with Forbin. I deferred in agreeing to help Uxe by recommending that she first have a long heart-to-heart with Omu. Uxe had not known of Omu's prior extensive use of Forbin. It was time that both spilled their secrets to one another. So while I was in the shower enjoying the hot water, they were out in the living room having a heart-to-heart. It was time I finished up and went to find out what the results of that conversation were. Freshly scrubbed and dressed in a pair of soft shorts and a light shirt, I returned to Uxe's living room. She and Omu were still in their virtual discussion, which had begun before I had gone to take my shower. "We are wrapping up our accelerated virtuality now, John. Uxe will be out in moments," Omu said. I used the delay to make myself a cup of tea in Uxe's auto kitchen. Uxe woke from virtual just as I returned. She smiled when she saw that I had brought her a cup as well. "We have shared our knowledge, John. Omu has relayed to me many details about Forbin which I had been unaware of. I have shared with her my plan for how the experiments should be run and for what I hope to learn. After what I have learned, I am still determined to proceed. Will you help?" I sipped my tea while I thought. After a long moment, I turned to Omu. "Will Naomi help?" "I anticipate that it will not unless you mandate that it do so, John." That was sobering. "What about you, Omu? Do you think Uxe's Forbin experiments will be safe?" The android hesitated. "I currently lack the processing resources to properly consider the issue, John. I am sorry." Shit, I continued to think. Finally, an idea came to me. Would it help if you shared some of Truffles' resources, even if it was temporary? Omu seemed to brighten at the thought. "Yes, that would help immensely, John." "Uxe, here is what I want. If you and Truffles would permit, I'd like Omu to link with you both. Then together you can study the issues and refine the experiments as needed to reduce the risks to an acceptable low level. If Omu can be made to fully understand the issues and if she agrees that the risks are worth it, then I will help you as far as compelling Naomi to provide its assistance. Deal?" Ux quickly agreed. They would begin in the morning with a three-way linkage via the quantum-protected optical link. This would spare them the need to physically travel back to the remote experiment area where Truffles resided. With a plan of action established, Ux and I went to bed. We made love slowly and tenderly, and the release helped me finally clear my mind enough to get a decent night's sleep. The next day, the three of them linked up and began their work. Noon approached with no sign of their work session ending. I ate and kept myself entertained while Ux's augment kept her shell fed and watered. It even walked her shell, dragging the data link the whole time, to the bathroom to handle its toilet needs occasionally. The virtual session continued into the night, and when Ux finally was ejected back into the real, she was so mentally exhausted that she went right to bed. I suspected that their session was happening at an accelerated time setting and hoped that no long-lasting harm was being done. The next day was a repeat of the last. I spent most of the day in the closer of the gravity train's two nature parks. It did not take very long before I became a hit with the children. The few human parents, along with the more common android nannies, had had no problems letting the kids skip their normal nature playtimes to instead hear me tell stories about my life on old Earth. The following day, I formalized the story session into something like a real history class. It felt good to be teaching again, and being around the kids gave me a joy I had not felt in a long time. I had no idea how long I would be able to continue the impromptu lessons, so I finished each day as if it were the last and never gave homework. The end to the classes would come just a few days later. Omu announced that night that they had successfully developed a plan for running the experiments at Forbin. There were still risks, but Omu was now convinced that they were worth taking. We would be needing specialized memory units and static processors, which Truffles and Ux were already busy fabricating. The fabrication would take 2 days, and as soon as the needed items were constructed, we could leave for Earth. The next day, instead of class, I arranged ice cream treats for my kids and said my goodbyes. It was a fun party and also surprisingly bittersweet. I also sent a message to Naomi on Earth. I told her about our plans to use the Forbin platform and that I would contact the AI when I was in Earth orbit to discuss the matter further. About an hour later, I received the AI's confirmation. I was not surprised when the message included the news that the AI had anticipated our plans and was standing by. The day after that, we were in space, preparing ourselves for the high-G return trip to Earth.